right? Earring versions might have a little bit more.
Books are books, since that's something everybody pretty much has, I think. I did queue up the field guide videos, so you might want to look for those, and you can look into how to deal with water and mold and different things, fire. So it's something to explore on your own. They're really great. So I've got 4 different batches of things here. The bound materials, I got some bound stuff mixed in there too, but those are like little pamphlets and flyers and a map. I only had 1 map, but that'll be fun to pull out. And then we have some file folders and loose sheets of ledger papers that are starting to have their dyes bleed. And then we get to the photos and film in the last tray. So these have just been soaking the last hour or so, and they're not quite as bad. But we have a bucket that I started last night, and as we saw in the video, these were really loose when I put them in here last night, and the water was up to about here. But now it's all been just absorbed into the books, and they're kind of stuck. And so we'll pull them out and see what some of the issues are. But you can see that the boards are expanding, and the paper is starting to get all wavy and staining. If you don't want to handle these, I don't blame you. They're getting a little slimy because some of the stuff in the binding starts to get kind of funky. So I'm going to have you guys jump in and start pulling things out I guess I'll do one. So if you have a book that is, yes, things are running nicely. And that's what I forgot.
Gloves.
No, I don't need gloves, but
You should.
but you guys can decide if you want gloves. I have some in the kit. Everything should wash off. There's some wax paper that I left on the table over there, if somebody could run that down to me. Yeah, I open. So depending on what your books look like when you take them out, we're usually in such a rush that we would only do this for the ones that have bleeding dyes. If we're going to freeze them, like this one is super soaked, so you're better off freezing it. And this is where a handy reference shows up. If we're freezing for bugs, we put the plastic on the outside of the cardboard box. If we've got stuff that's super wet, you need to put a plastic bag on the inside of the box, because your books are going to soak through, and when you try to lift the box, it's going to just disintegrate. So that's when you see the plastic on the inside of the box. A lot of places will recommend that you wrap each in butcher paper or wax paper and put them in, and that will help with separating them when you take them out of the freezer. So you might load up a whole bunch of boxes for the freezer, and then you take them out 1 box at a time, and then you only have maybe 30 books to deal with at once instead of 1,000. But you would wait for them to thaw enough so that you can get them out, because they will stick together a little bit. But if you don't do this step and you just put a book like this in, everything's going to come out with color transfer. So that's one thing. If you have books that are just a little bit wet, or when you have it completely soaked, I'll take that out of the way. You can fan out the pages if they want to fan out. You can check and make sure that it's not coated paper, because then you do need to deal with it right away. If you have really wet boards, you can take little pieces of blotter and insert them to try to get the moisture separated out and start the drying process. But your paper will be much more fragile when it's wet. We usually leave them sit for a while one way, and then you flip them over and let it dry out the other way. So this first one is just to start the fans going, and then as it starts to dry, you can come and help them fan out. The reason we flip them over is that the bottom's not able to dry as well, and so the water is pooling down towards the bottom, and so you just flip it over and continue the drying. And this will take, at least overnight. It might take several days to get things dried, and you might come in each morning and just flip things over and keep the pans running. So, who wants to get dirty? So there are several books, there's some file folders, there's some loose sheets of paper, and the paper, after being smashed in there, I'm expecting that it might tear, it might be difficult to get out.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about how well they maintain their structure. It's like the binding usually coming apart if they get.
You'll have all kinds of things happening with your books. So Kylie's just pulled out something in one of our old pamphlet binders, which is like a heavy duty cardstock. So in the case of something like this, there's not a lot of information on the cover. A better way to deal with it might be to cut it out and hang it, like you saw in the PowerPoint. Because that cover is going to retain a lot of moisture, and it's not going to be any good when it dries. So you would want to take that out with either a scalpel or scissors. Or you learn from the materials as they react, and so they're all going to react differently. So that cloth tape has gotten all gummy, and it's just coming apart. And so there's enough information on the cover, and it's in good condition so that you'll be able to figure out what this is in the future, and you probably don't need to retain that call number. But if it was something that you were really concerned about, you could just tear off this part and keep it with the book, because we're going to throw that away. And we do the same thing for file folders as well. But once the folder's been through the flood, you're probably going to want to replace it. Okay, and so you got a good one there.
Except it doesn't have the.
It didn't run enough.
Yeah.
I picked out red special because usually they just bleed all over the place.
You're just warping though.
Yeah, and so your boards will warp the longer you leave them in there. So one of the things that we do is after you dry them, you probably will have a lot of waviness in the papers, and your boards may have distorted. And so once they've dried for a couple of days, I neglected to put a slide in for that. But we would stack the books 4 or 5 high, and you can stack them with boards on top and a brick or something to flatten them back out, and try to get some of the shape back. But they will, and you need to do that because they will expand if you don't go through that flattening process, and you'll have a hard time getting the same amount of books back in the same place. Okay, what else we got in there? So this one has a plastic cover on it, which sometimes we keep at the library, but you would want to cut that off
and dry it separately. So,
Even if you're trying to keep it, you don't want it to retain the moisture on the.
right, because the boards are not gonna be able to dry out fast enough. You're gonna grow mold if you don't take the plastic off the cover. The exception would be if you're gonna go for vacuum freeze drying, you might be able to get away with leaving it all together and sending it out, because then it just sucks the moisture out of the materials. So that, so I have a scissors in that bin.
Do you want to avoid using the books?
So it depends how saturated they are. If they're really soaked like this, a better approach is probably to freeze them if you can. It depends whether you have access to a freezer. But if you get a book super soaked at home, you can do this or throw it in the freezer. If your book had been open at the time that it got wet, one of the things they say not to do is try to close it. So, so this is the experience of what all happens with it once it gets wet. It's very different from the books we usually handle. So you're going to cut that all out if you want to try and save the cover.
Should you completely remove the plastic, or you keep it with the cover, hold it together?
I would remove it from the book. I'm trying to wrestle it off of there now. Oops, and there we got another one that's releasing. So I'll let you handle the book. And then this, you would probably want to get rid of the plastic completely if you could, but it would probably dry like this if you feel like it's too fragile and you can't get the paper off of the plastic. You could lay it out and dry it.
Do you recommend?
So this one I would not, because I think that's the only thing that's holding your cover on. The book's had some work done on it in the past, and so you're gonna have everything is a new experience, because you can't always predict what they're gonna do when they get wet. And so yeah, you could just start it out this way, and this drains it, and as the pages start to loosen, because you don't want to start prying at it when it's this soaked. One of the things they say is if you had a book on exhibit or a book on your desk and you had a leak and it got soaked, you want to just transport it in the way that it was. You don't want to force a soaked book closed that's been just open like that, because it's going to have all expanded, and you can start to, with this, you would just start at that point. Is it all going to fall off? So another thing that you can do is for little pamphlets or soft cover books, you might have to do something to hold them up, because they're going to want to slump and fall over. That's why the pamphlets, it's better to just open it up to the center and string it over a clothesline if you can. You can get a lot done that way. But soft cover books are problematic because they're too thick to put over a clothesline. They're not going to dry in time. And they're probably not going to want to stand up for you. Okay? I'll start loading some of these into the box. And we'll pull out some more things. Oh, you got a folder. with a folder, depending how much paper is in it, and depending how precious it is, you may want to separate out each page and fan them out on screens would be ideal, or you could put some blotter or newsprint on some tables, but you can see how quickly this is going to take up a ton of drying space.
Yeah.
And so they would probably, this much stuff would probably dry okay outside of the folder. So you would probably just take that and then leave the, tear that off and leave the folder information with it. So you're just going to have to be very careful in your arrangement and methodical about the way that you work. Another thing that I didn't include earlier was that, when you're trying to build support for your planning, we all have little emergencies that happen, and you should always do a lessons learned. So you bring your team together and say, what could we have done differently? What supplies did we not have on hand? What phone numbers do we need to fix? And those small events can open that conversation to, hey, if this had been library-wide, we really would have been in trouble because we didn't even know what to do when we had these 10 shelves of books get wet. And so that's how you can approach your administration as well. We need to start doing some of this training and updating our material. Okay, keep going. We got more things in there. We didn't get to the inkjet prints yet. That's a good one. It's extra slimy. Yeah, so the books are usually pretty straightforward. We've seen some of the trouble that you can have. It's nice to have blotter if you have it, to just put it in there. And you want to check for coated paper whenever you're opening them up. Just make sure it's regular paper. Because if you were to stand this up and it was coated paper and you wait long enough that the pages start to fan out, if it's coated paper, they might never fan out. They might just freeze into that shape. Yeah, you can just leave it up there, because I think we'll see that as we work our way down the table that those pages will probably start to release on their own. Okay. So it's good to experience what the wet paper feels like, because the longer you leave it in there, the more it's going to want to return to pulp. And so now we've got the problem with inkjets, which that really should be one of the very first things you deal with.
Would you try to separate liquid if you can?
If you had access to a freezer, that would be the first place to go. This one, I think that one's kind of a fun one, so you can pull off that Valpak one. Yeah. Because this one is a problem. If you don't have a freezer, all the contents of this are coated paper, so you can't just dry it like that. So in this case, you would have to take it apart. Depending how precious that is, you would be very careful not to skin it or tear it. And then this is where a micro spatula might be helpful, but a screen would be really helpful. And fingernails and glass would be really helpful. So you're gonna need to separate each one. And ideally, depending how wet they are, if you had Rime, that would be good. So I've talked a little bit about Rime. It's this polyester mesh, and so things won't get stuck to it as much as they would to the blotter paper. But this would be perfectly fine. They would dry like that, and I don't think they'd be bonded. So this, you can try to get them apart.
So would you let them sit a little bit until it's a bit drier, or straight to the
No,
freezer?
if you can get them to the freezer, you get them to the freezer soaking wet. Because with bleeding dyes, you want to stop that from going further. But if you couldn't, then you would want to separate the pages as quickly as possible also, because you might have some that have dyes and others that don't. And you want to get the ones away so that they're not transferring onto other materials. Okay. Anybody else want to jump into the bucket? Huh? Waiting to do the less dramatic ones. So we have other books that I've just put in this morning. Some have different issues. It's sticking because they're not completely in the water, so this can actually be a little more challenging to get apart because they're starting to stick together. This is a coated paper cover. So again, you check the paper and the paper is not coated, but the cover is. So you need to make sure that that is isolated from your pages. And so you would want to either use some of those blotters to insert them. And for something like this is a contender for bookend. So it may or may not stick to the other paper. It might be okay. It's when you have coated paper next to coated paper. So yeah, they're going to want to move where they're going to want to go. And you're not going to have enough to do everything, so you kind of just got to fumble through it. So we got another one of these guys. Again, I would take it out of the plastic jacket. We have some bleeding dyes already. That's good. And even though that's only been in there for an hour, that is just totally soaked through because it was in the bottom. So it doesn't take long. And how often are you actually responding within the first hour? So more likely you're going to be dealing with something like what was in that bucket. Or if it's on the shelf and it's just been rained on from above, maybe a lot of the water has drained out and you'll just have pooling on the shelves and wicking up from the bottom with boxes in record storage. You can get coated boxes that might survive the flooding, but hopefully the water has gone off your boxes and drained and hasn't soaked up too much into the materials, and then you would discard the boxes. More books to play with if you guys want to just set them off. And then we'll keep moving our way down the table.
I have a question. This is just water. What about water and mud? How much weight did the mud and the leaves and whatever came down from Manoa Street add to that part of that process?
A lot. We found leaves and mud and all kinds of stuff. So books and mud is a real problem because in order to really get them clean, you would want to wash them. So you would reserve that for only your most precious books, because your binding and everything else. We had some that just had mud on the edges and on the covers, and so we did a lot of dry cleaning. And so it would start out with a coarse brush, knocking off the big mud, and then following with shredded eraser crumbs. So you would use white erasers, like a Magic Rub or Statler. You don't want to use a pink eraser or anything that might transfer the color onto the paper. But you would try to then remove that from the cover and the sides. Hopefully, I mean, the beauty of a bound book is that that cover is providing a ton of protection if it's left in place and it's not scattered all over the floor and open up. And so oftentimes we would have just had the mud on the cover and on the edges, and then you can try to clean that. Once it gets into the paper itself, hopefully you can replace the book. But your rare books, you might want to talk to a conservator about case by case.
I guess you have to know your limits, right? Well, how
You
much can you
do.
do, and then how much should you really defer to a conservator?
Yeah, and so that's where if you can get things in a freezer, you just get things in a freezer and then you bring the conservator to consult with you, and you say, hey, you know, we got some of these rare books that we know got wet. How do we deal with these? And sometimes the binding is a really important part of that book's history, and you want to save that. So that would be best left to a conservator. But for books that you can replace, sometimes the damage is going to be so bad that you're better off going that route. So it's weighing so many different factors of cost and staff time, how much you're really able to handle. A lot of issues. So again, coated paper, so we need to drive that separately. The pamphlets, these are borderline. These are getting pretty thick to how much you're going to be able to dry it on a line. Good candidate for freezing, because even if you just leave it in the freezer without the vacuum freeze drying, over time things dry out in the freezer. Like, think of freezer burn on your home freezer. So then it wouldn't be quite the same when you pull it out and defrost it. It's not going to be as soaked if you leave it in there a long time.
And then at that point, do you hang it on while they're defrosting, or after it's kind of defrosted and not so soaked?
Something like this, it might be too thick for it to dry in time that mold doesn't set in. So in the case of something like this, I would probably take Remy or paper towels and interleave them every few pages. And then you're going to have to keep replacing those. So you would insert, and that blotter is going to soak out water, and you just keep replacing it. And if you don't have bleeding dyes, you can just let that dry and reuse it too. So you're just going to have to keep cycling through.
You can't do anything for the wrinkling while it's wet.
No, you really can't. Yeah, you just have to accept. Let it do what it's going to do. The one exception to that is when it's encapsulated. You need to get it out of plastic. Or if this were, oh, this one is actually bonded on there, so you don't have a choice. But the other one, you could take it off if you wanted to, if you had the time and it was that important to try and save that. You might try to get the paper off of the plastic, because it's going to expand at a trying to expand, but it's stuck to the plastic, so it's gonna cause that rippling. So, I wanna make sure we have time for this fun stuff down here. So the folders, again, I put a couple of, they didn't get wet. So I was hoping this was gonna run, but it didn't. So we're in luck. And it barely got wet, so that you could just lay out to dry. Not gonna be so much of a problem. And then once you see in the middle that these are all starting to get really soaked. And if you hold things at an angle, the water will sheet off a little better than if you just hold it flat. So it's the same thing with drying the books on edge. But this is one of the fun tricks that I do want you to be able to try. You can see that the inks are bleeding. It's beautiful old handwriting. And so rather than going straight in and trying to lift out big sheets of paper that are soaking wet, that may be on their way back to becoming paper pulp, one of the things you can do is try to support it. I'm feeding back. And now, this will be a little tricky because I'm onto several of them at once. But it, see? And if we can get, so one thing you want to do is make sure your work area is set up before you start grabbing things. But this is all part of the exercise, is going, oh, I could have done that differently. I should have put down a piece of rime and had it sitting right next to the bucket. And then it's on here. And it's not going to dry on the plastic. But then you're going to want to set out your next one. And I'll turn this over so whoever wants to try to fish some of those out of there.
And that would also help the ink from going down with the water, right? Yours just pick it up.
Maybe. Might help hold things in place a little bit. Well, the main thing it's doing is providing support for the paper. We know when we're transporting large paper, it's good to have them encapsulated or in folder stock or something. You can also put them on rime or mylar. So that one I was hoping would get wet, but it hasn't gotten all the way down in there. But this is one that I would just take the scissors and cut out the sheet of paper, throw away the sleeve. Yeah, just bounce it and throw it away. And if you didn't have mylar, you can, in a pinch, you can use other materials. So the polyester will work as well. The remake will work in place of the mylar. The mylar just is a nice sturdy one that it really kind of vacuums it onto there.
Everybody should seriously do
Yeah,
this.
yeah. That's the best part.
The theory is nothing like the practice.
I'm gonna take this one away as I viciously handle the wet paper. judgment call. It depends how fragile has your paper gotten while it's sitting in there.
Anybody else?
I like try.
So let's see whether it'll stick, because that one didn't get totally wet. So maybe he'll push it down into the water to get it. For the full effect. And then that allows you to just separate out one sheet at a time. But you can see you're gonna need a ton of drying space, and that's why the screens work really well if you can do a sort of a racking system.
So you purchased these spoons, or you guys made them?
They made them.
Oh, they made it?
Yeah.
And the duct tape is so that you can replace the screens.
That was just because,
Because of the pokes
it's,
from the
yeah,
screens.
so you don't wanna catch on anything. So it's just to make it a smoother edge, you don't wanna have any, sure. We did this with some people from state civil defense, cause they wanted to know what kind of training we did for the cultural community. So we actually did a custom West Pass training for them, with Lynn Davis.
So eye-opening for them.
It was, and so we just did a mini version of this with some books and these ledgers, and their accountant was just like, and then he asked if he could keep it when it was all over. Can I keep it? Yeah. Yeah, take it.
I was gonna ask, is like torture boy, so I was like, oh, where did these come from?
Uh-oh.
Permanent, huh?
Wasn't permanent. We have one that we've been working off of for years that was disposal.
Keep talking.
Yeah, and I don't think you need to really push it down onto there. You just need to get the one corner started, and it'll release as you pull the mylar off. Did you get to try?
Malia, where'd you get that plastic?
That's mylar. You can buy it in sheets or rolls, different thicknesses. So this is probably one of the thicker one, like 4 or 5 mil. This is 3.
No.
So any scraps will work for what we're doing here.
Thanks.
But if you'll remember from preservation classes, they do the mylar book jackets. You would use like the 5 mil, because that'll hold its shape better.
So these ones you wouldn't stack?
You wouldn't stack them. You could interleave them with the ream and the blotting paper, and then you have to keep switching it out. But that way you can go vertically. And one of the tricks is to have your material sticking out wider than what you're trying to save, because there's like a capillary action that wicks the moisture out of it. And if you had pans going and your stack of things, it's going to be pulling some of that moisture out. But you're still going to need to be switching it out and checking to make sure it's not sticking to it. Okay, so real quick, we're just going to wrap up with the AV materials. Maybe I'll come down this way a little bit. So right away, I go, oh no, we have microfilm. So we would fill the bag with water and take the whole thing and send that off to a lab. But you need to leave it in the water. You don't want it to dry out. And it's going to have to ship wet like that.
Do you do one per bag?
You could fit more in, yeah,
If they're still in the water.
because you're just sending it off to get processed. So it's gonna have to run through a machine. With the microfilm, it is important that you not remove it from the box because that's your information.
So would you double bag or triple bag it? Cause if you're gonna ship it, you don't want the water to be.
Yeah, you're gonna have to ship it in something that's not gonna be leaking water everywhere. For CDs and DVDs, if you have important information on the wrapper, you're gonna try and save that. And if you had an old dish rack, you would, go them through your different water baths, rinse it, and then line them all up standing on edge. You can also string them through the hole. You may have seen them like that. So that's a solution for CDs. Photos and film, you would do a big clothesline and you're gonna hold it on the edge where there's no image if possible, and you just clip them on there. String them all up, and if there's information, you keep it with them. This one I'm curious to see what happened because the last time we did this exercise, these got bonded together and I kept them. So once a photo's been wet, usually the recommendation is not to put it back in water. Photo in water is after they've been created, they're not supposed to. But if if this was like the most important one in your collection, you would want to freeze it and have a conservator look and see whether there's any possible way to unbond them. But the chances are pretty bad once that happens. We did attempt this with some of the giant maps that had been photoed, and trying to get them back, because even if they just had a portion of it, it was still something they wanted to retain, and they couldn't keep them just all bonded together. But yeah, that's not releasing. So these ones are pretty easy because they have a border, so you just clip them. If it's something else, you want to clip it in one of the areas that doesn't have a lot of the information value, because the emulsion can get soft, it could stick, it could peel, it can do all kinds of bad things once it gets wet. So I think we've gotten through everything. Questions? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is, so when we had our fire, when I worked at Michigan Tech, there were glass plate negatives. What's your recommendation on that?
So if they get wet and it's the two sheets of glass together, you remove the edge and you dry them separate.
Yeah.
So you don't want them to have water get in between there and grow mold.
But you can't freeze them, right? They're one of the few things that you can't
Yeah.
freeze.
You're not supposed to freeze them, and a lot of the older formats of photos, like tin types, daguerreotypes, are never supposed to go in the freezer. So if you have those types of things that are not regular paper, you need to see what can and cannot be frozen, and that's gonna be something you're gonna train on for your specific collection. So yeah. I probably could have come up with some glass plate negatives. We have some that I think are discards.
What about the silver nitrate negatives? Are they like the photographs where they'd be able to go in the freezer?
I think so. I think they can be frozen. When possible, and if you have a small number of photos, I think it's best if you can air dry them. They don't last well in a freezer over time. Oh.
Have you seen over like decades, at certain decades, you could tell the material type is
easier to salvage versus more recent where there's cheaper inks and cheaper glues?
Yeah, so you're gonna find that with old books, that the quality of the paper was much more durable way
Mhm.
back when. You're gonna have things from the mid-1800s to around 1990 that the paper is often not so good. And then it's become a little bit better, but those early books are gonna have nice sturdy paper that might survive the best. With inkjet prints is a special area of research for the Image Permanence Institute there at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and old photos, you don't see any bleeding dyes, but if you had printed inkjet onto photo paper, you put them in water and they might just start bleeding all over the place. You wanna get them in a freezer right away and just stop that, and then work on salvage later. And so, yeah, some of those newer technologies were just untested, we didn't know what the implications. It's a big issue for art collections that have been purchasing digital photography as fine art. It has its own set of issues. So I think I need to let you all go, it's noon now, and thanks for all coming and spending part of your Saturday with us.